If you look at the total murder rate in our nation, the vast majority of murder victims in our country are men, not women. Yeah, we hear this trope from feminists that women are more likely to be the victims of intimate partner violence, and that itself is true. And it's bad. I'm not saying that that's anything that can be justified. It's not.
You serious?
We know from research feminists don't like to cite that most domestic violence is actually initiated by women. In their report, Differences in Frequency of Violence and Reported Injury Between Relationships with Reciprocal and Non-Reciprocal Intimate Partner Violence, Daniel J. Whitaker and his team analyzed data from a longitudinal study of young U.S. adults aged 18 to 28 years, which contained information about partner violence and injury reported by 11,370 respondents on 18,761 heterosexual relationships. They found that over 75% of relationships were non-violent. Of the nearly 24% that had some violence, 49.7% were reciprocally violent, also known in another study by Jennifer Langen-Richson-Rolling and her team as bidirectional violence. Their comprehensive review of 48 studies that reported rates of bidirectional versus unidirectional physical violence was titled Rates of Bidirectional versus Unidirectional Intimate Partner Violence Across Samples, Sexual Orientations, and Race Ethnicities, a comprehensive review. The team found that 84% of relationships were nonviolent and only 16% were violent. Among that violent segment, 57.9% was bidirectional, and over 2/3 of unidirectional violence was female perpetrated, indicating the question, who is initiating the bidirectional violence? Whitaker and team reported their analysis had found that among the reciprocally violent young adults, half the relationships they'd identified with some reported violence, reciprocity, or bidirectional violence, was associated with more frequent violence among women, but not men. And in non-reciprocally or unidirectionally violent relationships, women were the perpetrators in more than 70% of the cases. Examining the two reports together seems to lead to the indication that domestic violence is more often initiated by a female partner. But if you look at sources of information about domestic violence created by the victims' advocacy industry, it is often difficult to find anything that doesn't strongly emphasize the female victim, male perpetrator stereotype over its gender-flipped counterpart. Both sexes experience intimate partner violence, but only one sex, the one that is statistically more likely to resort to violence during intimate partner conflicts, is the beneficiary of widespread financially backed consideration and compassion.
Okay, so this is what feminism is about, right? We don't have to get into all this. We all know that feminism is not about equality under the law. It's not about equal rights for women. It's not about women having the choice to either stay home with their children or be in the workforce, and that it's their choice to make. That's what feminism was originally billed to be, right? That we just want equality under the law. We want to be able to vote. We want to be able to own property. We want to choose whether we work or stay home with our kids. That's not what feminism is.
You serious?
While it is true that prior to the creation of the welfare state and the birth control pill, we didn't see the mass breakdown of the family, everything else in that statement is wrong. The early women's movement not only produced raging women who hated men and made that hatred a central part of their ideology, it was largely conceived and promoted by such women who consistently misrepresented women's social position. And the movement rarely, if ever, expressed any goodwill towards men or appreciation for their contributions to society. Although then as now there were reasonable women in the movement, its founders often declared their hatred explicitly. The most famous and revealing document of the 19th century women's movement in the United States is the Declaration of Sentiments, written primarily by feminist leader Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Presented at the Seneca Falls Women's Convention in 1848, the Declaration is filled with statements asserting the near measureless brutality and injustice of the male sex towards the female. What emotion, if not hatred, was designed to be evoked by the Declaration's central thesis that, quote, the history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpation on the part of man toward woman, having indirect object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her, end quote. What should a free-born citizen feel about an absolute tyranny deliberately perpetrated through repeated injuries and usurpation? This fire-breathing allegation is followed by a long list of dubious and sometimes outright false claims against men, including what today would be deemed psychological abuse, the claim being that, quote, he, man, has endeavored in every way that he could to destroy her confidence in her own powers, to lessen her self-respect, and to make her willing to lead a dependent and abject life, end quote. Remember that this statement was written at a time when many colleges had been established specifically for women's education, contradicting another of the claims in the Declaration about, quote, all colleges being closed against her, and at a time when many women made respectable careers for themselves as authors, educators, scholars, and businesswomen. There is nothing in the document to mitigate the mass condemnation of men or to suggest that biology or circumstances played any role in the present social order. There's nothing in the document to suggest that men ever acted to protect or provide for women or to respond to their needs. The fact that men signed this self-condemnation, there are 32 male signatories, gives the lie to the document's assertions about male tyranny and lust for power. And the fact that the document is considered the beginning of the women's rights movement in America and that it spawned many later women's conventions demonstrates that both men and women of the time and later approved public expressions of fanatical anti-male animus. The English suffragettes of the early 1900s fully justified a phrase like raging women. They were an insurgent force determined to win their revolutionary aims through law-breaking and the deliberate pathologizing of masculinity. Led by Emmeline Pankhurst and her two daughters, their organization, the Women's Social and Political Union, distinguished itself by militant tactics that included vandalism and violent protests that endangered the women's own and others' lives. Members of the WSPU regularly smashed windows, destroyed property, assaulted police officers, and carried out a nationwide bombing and arson campaign, including the firebombing of the homes of members of Parliament. Such radicalism was necessary, according to their leader, Pankhurst, because, quote, the condition of our sex is so deplorable that it is our duty even to break the law in order to call attention to the reasons why we do so, end quote. In fact, Pankhurst was a wealthy woman whose life of ease and privilege stood in shocking contrast to that of the majority of her male compatriots, many of whom didn't possess the right to vote and lived lives of hardship that she couldn't imagine and didn't care about. In the modern insistence that only men are violent and that masculinity is disordered and pathological, contemporary feminism is the direct descendant of a centuries-old calumny. Feminism's use of derogatory slurs such as toxic masculinity and its constant emphasis on female victimhood by men indicate the direct line that can be drawn between male-accusing first-wave feminists and their vicious progeny today.
Because what feminisms do is they construct this patriarchy, essentially. They construct this patriarchy because we don't live in a patriarchy. A patriarchy is like an actual repressive regime. You can think about a lot of Muslim countries in the Middle East where women are not allowed to leave the house without the permission of their male guardian, where they're not allowed to uncover their face, where they're killed for literally talking to someone from the opposite sex. That's a patriarchy. That is bad. That is wrong. That is evil. That is inequality. That is somewhere that women are targeted.
You serious?
One of my sources is The Female Jihad, Al-Qaeda's Women by Katharina von Knopp. I'm just going to read a little bit from the abstract. When women carry out a suicide attack, they undermine the idea of who and what a terrorist is. What is generally not realized is the extent to which women are involved in terrorism. The purpose of this article is to explore and analyze the multifaceted roles of women in the movement of Al-Qaeda. The argument is that the role of women the world audience perceives is one of suicide bomber, but the role of ideological supporter and operational facilitator is more important for the maintenance of the operational capabilities and the ideological motivation for a terrorist organization. This article argues that the women follow a gender-specific interpretation of the radical ideology, the female jihad. The concept of the female jihad means that women carry out a political act by supporting their male relatives, educating their children in the ideology, and facilitating terrorist operations. The female jihad is defective when women follow the male jihad interpretation by carrying out attacks. For the survival of a terrorist organization, women are more important when they follow the female version of the ideology because the men could get arrested, die in an attack, or could get shot by the security forces. The women continue to take care of the financial issues of the organization and continue to educate the children in the right belief. So essentially, because women are more likely to survive, they follow a different model that ensures the continuance of terrorist operations. And they do so by controlling the finances and the teaching of the ideology and the motivating of terrorists.
There was that woman, feminist woman, I don't know her name, but she said on a talk show, Islam is the most feminist religion. And there were people who were sharing it to say, ha ha ha, that's so hilarious because no way is that true, that's so funny. And I was like, no, actually, if you follow feminism to its, like, you know, ultimate conclusion, it results in Sharia. Because you got to protect women. Protect the women, protect the women, protect the women, protect the women, and make sure that they know how much constant danger they're in. That's where it's going to land. And they're going to love it. Because they're going to be like, I feel so safe in my burqa.
Yeah, don't you know that like hiding your features under a burqa, under a hijab, all that is just protecting you from the male gaze.
It is protecting you from the men. Mm-hmm.
And that's exactly how they frame it.
From the toxic male gaze, and it's really they do frame it in the sense of it's not necessarily even to protect women from being raped by men who can't control themselves. It's to protect women from the indignity of being looked at by unworthy men.
So what she's saying is that the sex in the Playboy mansion was transactional, which to a certain extent we always knew, right? Those of us who warned that the sexual revolution is a bad thing, and that separating sex and morality is going to create a fundamentally broken society. But that's what she's saying. She's admitting that sex is transactional. And who does transactional sex hurt the most? Well, it hurts women the most.
You serious?
Actually, Liz, it could be argued that men suffer more from transactional relationships, as studies do show that men invest a lot into relationships and a lot of emotions into it, and they are actually significantly hurt more by breakups than women are. And I have no reason to think that this necessarily wouldn't be true with one-night stands and the like, because people don't realize that men are expected to pursue women and thus they emotionally invest in it. And so I could imagine a man being hurt, if not more hurt, by a transactional relationship.